It began with rain. Not the kind that cleans a city, but the kind that makes it remember. I watched it thread down the tall windows behind the bench, thin silver lines trembling across a gray morning. The courtroom smelled faintly of damp wool and old varnish. Counsel moved like chess pieces. The gallery hummed with the low static of expectations. Somewhere beneath my robe, beneath the ritual and the rules, I felt the ache that always comes before truth decides whether to arrive or to keep driving past the courthouse. I have learned that a lie has a posture. It sits too straight. It breathes with shallow confidence. It turns its face toward me as if to prove it has nothing to hide, and in that performance, it betrays itself. The defendant, a contractor named Leon Vargas, sat at the defense table with his hands folded like a churchgoer's. Across from him, the plaintiff, a widow named Ruth Ellison, held a yellow legal pad with notes written in a tight schoolteacher's hand. Between them lay a house that never became a home, a renovation paid for, promised, and abandoned. But houses are never just houses when they come here. They become theaters, witnesses, mausoleums of trust. "Good morning, Your Honor," counsel murmured as I entered. The gavel found the block like a heartbeat. I looked at the oath placard on my bench, the words I whisper to myself on heavy days, to do right as best I can. I knew this case would test that promise in a quieter way than most. There would be no blood spatter charts, no blazing headlines. Only a broken promise, a tangle of invoices, and the slow drip of rain tapping out time while we waited to see who had come to the altar of truth wearing a mask.
When the case opened, the air in the courtroom carried tension thick enough to taste. Morgan walked in with a smooth confidence, the kind that made jurors uneasy. Eliza, by contrast, moved as though gravity itself had turned cruel. Her hands trembled slightly when she sat down, clutching the edge of her statement like a shield. "Your Honor," began the prosecutor, "this case is about betrayal masquerading as care." He painted a portrait of deception layered with affection, a lover who preyed upon the faith of another. The defense countered calmly, "It's a failed investment, not a crime. There was consent, trust, and risk. Nothing more." I watched them argue, but I listened to silence. The silence between their words, the look Morgan avoided, the tears Eliza suppressed. Those were the real testimonies. The court transcript would never capture the tremor in her voice when she said his name, or the flicker in his eyes when he heard it. Cross-examination is where masks fall. Under pressure, truth sweats. I leaned forward slightly as the prosecutor rose, eyes fixed on Morgan. "Mr. Lee," he began, "you claim you invested her money for both your futures. Tell us, why did you transfer the remaining balance into a private account the day before the market crashed?" Morgan paused. His lips parted, but no sound came. The defense objected. I overruled. "Answer the question, Mr. Lee." "It was precautionary," he said finally. "I didn't want to lose it all." The prosecutor took a slow step closer. "And did you tell Ms. Green about this precaution?" "No." "Why not?" "She was still recovering." The prosecutor's tone darkened. Recovering or vulnerable? Morgan's silence filled the room. Eliza's eyes glistened. It was then I noticed something, guilt not just of crime, but of conscience. A man who didn't regret the theft, only the exposure. Later, when Eliza took the stand, her voice was steady but hollow. He said, "Rest easy, I'll take care of everything." And I believed him.
The collision, then, was not just about wood and screws. It was about the geometry of trust. When a contractor speaks of unforeseen conditions, he invokes a clause. When a widow speaks of a promise, she invokes a covenant. The law listens to both and asks for receipts. Sharpened in that way, I've come to recognize, like a lens finding its subject. Plaintiff's counsel, Ms. Medina, stood with the stillness of a string pulled taut. She had organized her exhibits like a surgeon lays out instruments, before and after photos, text messages, bank transfers, a timeline pinned in color on poster board. Every date had a heartbeat. Defense counsel, Mr. Grady, wore the polite smile of a man accustomed to fires he believes he can put out with enough paper. He placed on my desk a folder thick with estimates, emails, and invoices, the bureaucratic snow that follows any job where human beings promise each other the future. I watched the faces. Ruth had the unconcealed watchfulness of someone who has spent nights rehearsing a story to walls that will never testify. Leon had the professional calm of a person who has learned to let the hinge of his jaw flex while saying, "I understand," even when he does not. In the third row sat a young man in a faded hoodie, Ruth's nephew, I learned later, tapping his foot so softly it could have been the rain. In the back, a woman with paint under her nails, one of Leon's subcontractors, perhaps. These rooms collect lives no one sees. The apprentice who learned the trade on Monday and will be fired by Friday. The bank officer who approved a loan and will never smell the sawdust of what it built. The neighbor who hears arguing through shared walls and tells herself it's none of her business. Court is where their echoes meet. We began. Ms. Medina called Ruth to the stand. The oath was spoken, the witness seated, the microphone adjusted. "I am not here for revenge," Ruth said, and a hush moved through the room like a shadow. "I am here to finish a promise." She told us about the first meeting with Leon, the glossy brochure, the references that called him affordable and fast, the way he tapped the wall with knuckles and said, "You've got good bones here." She confessed to paying the first draw sooner than scheduled because the demolition crew worked so hard. She described the day the beam was opened like a wound. He said it was worse than he thought. I said we'd do what needed to be done. When it was Mr. Grady's turn, he asked for the emails where Ruth allegedly refused a change order. He held up a printed screenshot with a subject line, "Scope adjustment." Ruth leaned forward. "He sent that after he stopped coming," she said. The adjustment was to be paid before any work resumed. The room breathed in and out. This is when the courtroom awakens, not with shouting, but with precise words. With the tiny levers of dates, with commas that move money, with a widow's mouth forming a promise even as it breaks. Cross-examination is a room inside a room. Its walls are made of questions. Its floor is tiled with previous statements. If you stand still long enough, you will feel whether the architecture holds. "Mr. Vargas," Ms. Medina began, "you testified that you stored the plaintiff's custom cabinets in your warehouse to protect them." "Yes." "Where's the warehouse?" "Off Highway 8. Do you have photographs of the cabinets there?" "We don't typically photograph storage." "Do you have receipts for the storage fees you charged the plaintiff?" "They weren't fees," he said, and his lawyer coughed softly. "They were costs." "Receipts?" "I can get them." The question echoed. I have sat through enough trials to recognize when a well changes its sound. What was once a steady bucket of explanations began to clink against stone. Ms. Medina moved gently, as if comfort could coax truth. "You also testified the city inspector delayed your framing work pending revised plans." "That's right." She handed him a document. "This is the inspector's note from January 7th. Please read the second line." He read, "Framing approved to proceed. Skylight rough-in pending manufacturer spec." "And when did you order the skylight?" "It was ordered." "When?" "I'd have to check." "With which supplier?" Silence. "We use a few," he said. Mr. Grady stood. "Objection, Your Honor," asked and answered. "Overruled," I said. "He can answer." "The truth is," Leon said finally, "the supplier couldn't confirm a date, so we were waiting." "Waiting where?" Ms. Medina asked. "On other jobs," he said, and something like wind moved through the gallery. Then came the texts. Blue and gray bubbles projected on the court screen, each with a timestamp that ticked like a metronome of patience. "Hi Leon, checking on Monday start?" "Hi Ruth, crew in sick, Thursday for sure." "Hi Leon, Thursday came and went. Understand, we'll make it up next week." Then, 3 weeks of silence punctuated by a single gray bubble. "Can we meet to discuss the third draw?" On the stand, Ruth watched her own words float across the room and land like feathers on a floor that had forgotten the warmth of bare feet. "He knew I wasn't a builder," she said quietly. "He knew I would wait." Mr. Grady's cross drew a different map. "Ms. Ellison, you changed your mind about materials, didn't you?" "I chose a different tile when the first one was no longer available." "And you refused to sign a change order for the beam repair." "I asked for an itemized list." "You threatened to withhold payment." I withheld nothing I owed. He held up a printed email. I will not be bullied. Finish what you started. Strong words, he said. They were all I had, she replied. I watched Leon as she spoke. His eyes dropped to his hands, to a callus on his thumb, to the ring he did not wear. Lies, when they begin to lose their balance, look for something to hold. Sometimes it is pride. Sometimes it is shame. Sometimes it is a memory of being 14 and asked to carry too much lumber for a back that would never be the same. I do not sit to punish those memories. I sit to separate them from the contract when the contract is what binds. The subcontractor with pain under her nails, Ms. Ortiz, took the stand in rebuttal. He owes me too, she said, voice dry as a dropped leaf. We framed the south wall. We were ready for the inspector. He pulled us off to another job. Mr. Grady attempted to unsettle her with timelines. She met each date with a text snapshot printed from her phone. The sound in the room changed again, the way a train shifts tracks while pretending it hasn't moved. I took the matter under advisement for an hour, which is an eternity measured in courthouse minutes. In chambers, the rain thickened. I read the contract line by line. Progress payment upon completion of the following milestones. Demolition, paid. Materials delivery, disputed. Framing, incomplete. Change orders must be written and signed by both parties. None were signed. I read the inspector's note again. I returned to the timeline and pressed a finger to each gap like a doctor finding pulse points on a sleeping patient. The law of contracts is mercilessly simple when it wants to be, a promise for a promise, consideration for consideration. But there is a doctrine that sits quietly behind the black letters, a recognition that some promises are made in unequal rooms. That is why we demand signatures on changes, why we require clarity where expertise is lopsided. I measured the testimony against that doctrine. I measured the rain.